I'm doing here is putting together a series of 1 to 2 minute negotiation insight videos that you can use at your leisure whenever you have a minute or two to spare to learn something about the topic of negotiation. Each video will have maybe an insight, a principle or a tactic or some strategy that you can apply in your career or in your everyday life. Every one of us is spending more time online. Every one of us is spending more time thinking about how to broaden our horizons and maybe learn something along the way. And my hope is that this series of videos gives you something that you can keep coming back to every once in a while and pick up one more piece of information. Now, I spend all of my time thinking about negotiation. I know that's not what you're doing with all of your time, but my hope is that the things that we're going to be talking about in this series of videos is going to be relevant to you and is going to help you achieve better understandings and better agreements for yourself and for the people that you care about. So enjoy, give feedback. If you have specific questions or topics that you'd like me to address in one of these videos, please reach out and send me some information about what you'd like me to talk more about. Send me an email, find me on Twitter, find me on LinkedIn. And if you really want to dig deeper into the topic of negotiations, there's a lot of great books out there. I'll recommend two. These are somewhat biased recommendations. The first book I ever wrote on negotiation with Max Bazerman is Negotiation Genius. A more recent book that I wrote is called Negotiating the Impossible. Like I said, there's many great books out there. It's a wonderful topic. It's a way to improve your life, and it's a way to improve the life of other people that you come across. Good luck and happy negotiating. Insights that I've put together, 1 to 2 minute videos where you can learn something about negotiation that hopefully will be applicable to you in your life, at work, in your career, and in your personal lives. The session today, the topic today is the right mindset. Now, people walk into negotiations with many different mindsets. Some people think of it as a game. Some people think of it as war. Some people walk in thinking of it as an opportunity to build a relationship. Some people's mindsets are more forward-looking and sort of long-term. Some people are much more focused on the near term. Mindsets can vary in a lot of different ways. There's no right or wrong mindset, but there are better and more advantageous mindsets in my experience. If you could walk into every future negotiation with only one mindset, if there was like a button you could press and it would activate a certain mindset in you as you walked into all of your future negotiations, I would strongly suggest walking into every negotiation with a learning mindset. As a negotiator, you are there above all else to learn as much as you can about all of the parties that are relevant to the negotiation, to learn as much as you can about the situation that you're in, to learn as much as you can about the different perspectives on the situation that you're in. That's your number one goal. That's not your only goal. There's a lot of other things you need to do. You need to persuade, you need to think analytically, you need to think about short and long term, but above all else, the mindset that's going to help you most in negotiations, if you have that learning mindset. Now, to take it one step further, what should we be learning about? I divide it up into sort of 4 categories: interests, constraints, alternatives, and perspectives. First, interests. Think about the other party. Why are they here? What do they care about more? What do they care about less? Why are they doing this deal today rather than 6 months from now or a year ago? What keeps this person up at night? What problem are they trying to solve? That's the interests. Constraints. Where do they have more flexibility? Where do they have less flexibility? What are things that they can give, and where are their hands truly tied? Are their constraints changing? Are there things that they can do now that they couldn't do previously? Are there things they might be able to do in the future that they can't say yes to today? So those are your constraints. Third, alternatives. What happens to them if this deal doesn't work out? What's their alternative? Who else might they be talking to? How else might they solve this problem? And perspective. How are they seeing this situation? Is this a big deal to them or a small deal to them? Now keep in mind, there's no good or bad answer to that. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you in a negotiation is that this isn't a big deal to them. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you in a negotiation is that this isn't a big deal to them. But understanding their perspective, how are they thinking about this negotiation? Is this central to what they're trying to accomplish or not so much? Are they seeing you as weak or strong? What is their mindset? Is very, very important. So if you focus on just those 4 things even, the interests, constraints, alternatives, and perspectives of all the parties that are relevant to the negotiation, you're going to do a much better job in your future negotiations. It's not your only job, but having a learning mindset is more likely to overcome the barriers that you run into often. And I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School, and this is part of a series of videos that I'm creating where over a couple of minutes, 1, 2, 3 minutes, I give you one negotiation tip, an insight, something about a principle or a tactic or strategy that you can employ to hopefully achieve better outcomes for yourself and for the people you care about. The topic this time, negotiating process before substance. One of the pieces of advice that I end up giving a lot to my students and to my clients is that they should get into the habit of negotiating process before they negotiate substance. What's the difference? Think of substance as everything that actually goes into the deal terms. These are the concessions either side is making. That's the substance of the deal. Process is what gets us from wherever we are today to the finish line. Now that finish line might be a signed deal, it might be the implementation of a deal, depending on the kind of negotiation you're in. Negotiating process before substance can be crucial. Now let me give you an example. Imagine you've been negotiating a deal for about 6 or 7 months. And let's also imagine that for a negotiation like this, it's a decent amount of time. You finally get to the point where you think the finish line is in sight. You think this deal might get done. So you think it's a perfect time to put forward last 1 or 2 concessions that you can afford to make that hopefully will seal the deal. So you make those final concessions, and the other side looks at you and says, wow, this is fantastic. I really appreciate this. This makes a difference. Now, if you don't mind, let me just go talk to my boss and see what she thinks about all of this. And you're sitting there saying, wait, what? You have a boss? I thought we were done. I thought this was it. I've got nothing left to give. That would be an example, albeit a stylized example, an example of what can go wrong when you fail to negotiate process before you negotiate substance. Negotiating process is asking the other party things like, early on, asking things like, how long does it take an organization like yours to do a deal like this? What are some things that might speed things up, and what are some things that might happen that might slow things down? Who all needs to be on board if this deal is going to get done? Process before substance can also be more micro things, like asking the other party, who's going to be in the meeting tomorrow? What's going to be on the agenda? Okay, what about these other things that we care a lot about? When will we get to those? How are we going to know if we're on track? Now notice all of these questions, all of this information is not substantive. It's not going to go in the contract. You're not making progress. You're not making concessions or asking for concessions. What you're doing is getting an understanding of the process. You're getting clarity on it. You're getting some commitment on it so that you can navigate the negotiation better as you go forward. When you negotiate process before you negotiate substance, you're just less likely to make substance mistakes later on. Good luck with your negotiations, and if you want to read more about negotiations, there are 2 books that I recommend. Of course, these are biased recommendations, as I always say. The topic today, negotiating interests, not positions. One of the principles that's been in the world of negotiations, in the field of negotiation for many decades, is this distinction between negotiating interests and negotiating positions. Your positions are what you want. I want more time. I want a higher salary. I want the deadline to be July 1st. These are your positions. Your interests are not what you want. Your interests are why you want these things. Your underlying motivations, the underlying need that you're trying to fulfill. In negotiations, especially when you're in a situation where there's a deadlock, especially in the situation when you're just stuck, one of the things we often advise people to do is to shift the attention away from people's positions and the demands they're making to instead understand and engage with the underlying interests. Get away from the what people want to the why people want it. Because what often happens, not always, but what often happens is that you discover that what you want and what I want may be incompatible. We can't both get what we want. But our underlying interests might still be reconcilable. When you shift the conversation from what to why, when you stop going back and forth on your demands, but try to understand and try to communicate your underlying interests and motivations, what you sometimes find is that there are ways for you to help the other side achieve their underlying interest, which then makes them more flexible in the demands that they were making. If I can solve your underlying problem, that gives you more flexibility. So what great negotiators often do is find a way to shift the conversation from what to why, from positions to interests. Good luck on your negotiations. Today I want to talk about the distinction between patience, persistence, and perseverance. These are all words that you might associate with effective negotiation, especially if you're dealing with difficult negotiations, complex negotiations, or disputes. Maybe you're trying to resolve a protracted conflict, or try to win a really difficult client, or trying to scale your business. We need every one of these things, but there's a difference. Patience is not enough. Patience is that you're willing to wait. Patience is that you're going to stay cool and calm even if it takes a long time. And it's good because it requires a recognition that you're not going to get everything done, you're not going to achieve all your objectives right away. So patience is an important and necessary condition if you want to have success in difficult endeavors. Persistence takes it a step further. You're not just willing to wait, you're willing to keep trying. You're willing to keep knocking on doors. You're willing to keep putting in the effort. That's persistence. You need patience, but you also have to be working at these things over and over again. You can't just say, well, if it didn't happen today, I'll wait a year and see if it happens a year from now. You're going to have to keep working at it. So that's persistence. And then there's perseverance. To me, perseverance takes it one step further still. It's not just about willing to wait, and it's not about keep trying or keep working. It's about willingness to work harder, more creatively, see things differently, take the blows that come your way, adjust your strategy. That's perseverance. It requires patience, it requires some persistence, but it requires more than that. In fact, it's so important that my PhD advisor was a man by the name of Keith Murnian. He sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but he talked about how perseverance was one of the most important elements, most important characteristics, even as academics. And he used to make this point that his own advisor had said this to him, and to his fellow students. And he would say, it's so important, don't even call it perseverance. Call it perseverance. And he asked, well, why does that help? And his advisor said, if you call it perseverance, you're more likely to remember it, and it's more likely to stick in your head. And he said, because of that, it stayed in his mind for many, many years. And thanks to that, it stayed in my mind for now many, many years. And my hope is that it'll stay in your mind as well. You need patience, you need persistence, but you also need perseverance. Negotiations to get better outcomes for yourself and for the people you care about. In this video, we're going to talk about labeling your concessions. In any negotiation, at some point there's going to be some give and take. At some point you're going to make a concession, whether it's early on in a negotiation or later on. The hope is that once you make a concession, the other side is going to appreciate it, feel obligated to reciprocate, and then the give and take will begin. What you want is for your concessions to be rewarded, not exploited. The problem is it doesn't always work out the way you want. The fact of the matter is, when you make a concession, it can be seen as generous, it can be seen as kind, it can be seen as even smart or wise. It might show that you understand the need for give and take. But every concession you ever make in a negotiation can also be seen a different way. It can be seen as naive, or weak, or desperate. And if the attribution the other side makes is that you made this concession out of weakness or desperation or out of naivete, instead of getting the reciprocity you're hoping for, you might actually get exploited. They might start increasing their demands. They might expect even more from you. This is why one of the pieces of advice I often give to negotiators is get into the habit of labeling your concessions. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean every time you make a concession, you say, now, notice that's a concession, and I'm making it because I'm smart and nice. That would be pretty awkward. But it does mean that you want to get into the habit of thinking about how the other party is going to perceive the concession you're making. And you want to manage the attributions the other side is going to make. And that has implications for when you do and do not make concessions, in what context you make concessions, how you frame the concession that you're making. If you're going to make a concession and the result is going to be they're going to see you as desperate, weak, or naive, you want to think about how to make it at a different time or in a different way. When you get into the habit of labeling your concessions and managing their attributions, you're much more likely to get the give and take you want in the negotiation and to build the reciprocity and goodwill rather than to end up with a worse deal even though you did the right thing. Good luck. I want to talk about something called the curse of knowledge. Now, the curse of knowledge says that once you know something, you lose the ability to understand what it must feel like not to know it. Now, this curse of knowledge
is a big problem. It affects all of us. Think about a situation in which you figured something out, and the moment you figured it out, it seemed intuitive. Or think about times in your life where you've dealt with things that seem completely understandable and intuitive now, but when you first encountered them, seemed very, very complex and difficult to understand. The curse of knowledge is a problem for teachers who are trying to educate students, for parents who are trying to raise their children, but they can't exactly figure out how the child is thinking. It's a problem for leaders who are trying to lead members of their organization. And the curse of knowledge is a huge problem for negotiators. But it's also a reminder. It's a reminder that as negotiators, we can't simply walk into a room with a set of arguments that are designed to win the day. You can't just prepare your arguments. You must get into the habit of preparing your audience for your arguments. You need to think about what are the things these folks need to have understood, experienced, lived through, accepted as the basis of discussion before they're even going to be open to the merits of the case that I'm making. If you fail to do that, if you just march in there with a set of arguments that you think are going to convince them, but you haven't really understood where they're coming from, those ideas might get rejected. Those arguments might get rejected. And it won't be because they're incompetent or irrational or just don't get it. The reason they're not seeing it the way you're seeing it is because they're not you. So the next time you walk into a negotiation, don't just walk in with a strategy for convincing them with a set of airtight arguments, perfectly crafted rationale. Instead, try to step back and think about what do these people need to first experience, live through, accept as a foundation before these arguments are really going to make a difference. When you do that, you make it much more likely that your well-designed arguments and your well-crafted strategy actually pays dividends. Good luck. This particular video clip, what I want to discuss is negotiating with people that seem irrational. Very often people will ask me, how do you deal with someone, how do you negotiate with someone who's completely irrational, who's just doing crazy things? Now, what I often tell folks is that what looks like irrationality in negotiations is usually something a little bit different. What you think is irrational is probably one of three things. Now, before I get to what those three things might be and how to deal with the situation, let's first make sure we're talking about the same definition of rationality. In my view, someone is irrational if they will knowingly do something that is actually the opposite of what would be in their self-interest. So when somebody knowingly does something that would make them worse off, that seems irrational. And in my experience, rarely do you come across someone who's actually irrational. Rather, what looks like rationality is usually one of three other things. First, they're not irrational. They might just be ignorant. In other words, what looks like irrationality, what looks like somebody is doing something that is the opposite of what would be in their self-interest, is actually driven by misunderstanding, miscommunication, or ignorance on their part. So you make an offer that is the best offer they're ever going to receive from anybody, and they still walk away killing the deal. It seems irrational, but maybe what explains it is that they don't fully believe that this is the best offer they're going to receive, or you haven't educated them enough about how good the offer is, or they're not educated enough about what outcomes might exist outside. So what looks like irrationality in this case is actually ignorance. The second possibility is that what looks like irrationality is actually that they have interests that you don't fully appreciate. They have other interests other than what you think they should be caring about in this situation. So if somebody walks away from a deal with you and then actually does another deal with someone else that pays them or rewards them even less than what you're willing to offer, it seems pretty irrational. But maybe they care about things other than just money. Maybe they care about self-respect. Maybe they care about pride. Maybe they care about self-identity. Maybe they care about how they're treated. Now, there's nothing irrational about valuing these other things in addition to valuing dollars and cents. You can put whatever you want in your utility function. So what might look like irrationality from your perspective might actually be the other person trying to achieve a broader set of interests. Third possibility, what looks like irrationality is actually the fact that they have constraints that you don't fully recognize. They're walking away from the table, they're saying no to a deal that you think they should say yes to, or they're rejecting your request for something that you think is perfectly reasonable. It seems irrational, but maybe their hands are tied in ways that you don't fully appreciate, understand, or recognize. Maybe saying yes to you creates a precedent that they can't live with. Maybe they have a boss or other constraints that are keeping them from saying yes or doing the thing that you think would so clearly be in their best interest. So when you step back and you think about the behavior people are engaging in negotiation, and you set aside for a moment the idea that people are just irrational, and you ask yourself the question, what might actually explain this person's behavior? Why might a reasonably rational, reasonably competent person still behave in a way that looks crazy to me? You often end up thinking about these three things. Is there an understanding gap? Are there things that they're not educated about? Are there things that they're ignorant about? That might be a solvable problem. Are there interests that they're pursuing that I'm not fully recognizing? And maybe recognizing those gives me more leverage. Are there constraints that I'm not fully respecting? Are there things that make their hands tied that if I fully understood would allow me to navigate the negotiation slightly differently while still achieving my ends and respecting their constraints? So what I often recommend to people is before you write people off as irrational, instead try to understand what drives their behavior. Give them the benefit of the doubt, and you're actually going to be giving yourself the benefit of the doubt and providing yourself more leverage in the negotiation. If you're more interested in the topic of negotiation and you want to read something, here are two somewhat biased recommendations. In this particular clip, what I want to talk about is a problem that salespeople often run into. Now, the principle, the idea is much more broadly relevant, but I'll give you the example of a situation that occurs often in certain companies that I work with. I work with companies and sales teams that are often on the cutting edge of certain technologies. It could be cybersecurity, biotech, enterprise software. And one of the things that's happening when you are a salesperson in these environments is you're offering a product or service or solution that's solving a problem that's existed for a very, very long time. You've just found a way to solve it better, more effectively, more efficiently, more comprehensively, or you're solving more problems that have been solved previously by your competitors. The problem the salesperson will sometimes run into is that because of this technology being new and innovative and better, it's also often more expensive. And when you show up to the customer and to the buyer, the reaction is often something like, wait a second, this is like 5 times more expensive than what other people charge. This is like 2 times or 10 times more expensive than what your competitors are charging. Nobody pays this much for this kind of thing. Or the reaction is, this is like 5 times more expensive than doing nothing. I can't justify this. In a moment like that, when a potential buyer says something like, this is 2 times or 5 times or 10 times more expensive than your competitors, nobody pays this much for this kind of thing. The worst mistake, in my experience, the worst mistake a salesperson can make in that moment is when the salesperson apologizes for their price being too high. Now, I'm not suggesting they say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, please forgive me. They don't apologize in that way, but they seem apologetic. Hey, I understand there's going to be some sticker shock here, or yeah, I understand this is probably not what you're used to paying. And if this is about price, certainly we can discuss that. The moment you move in that direction, you've just handed the other side the license to haggle with you on price. You've just legitimized, you've just agreed that these reference points that they just gave about other prices from certain competitors of yours that are cheaper are an appropriate reference point. You've basically said to them that even you don't really believe the price is appropriate or is legitimate. And so haggling on it seems completely acceptable. But if you truly believe that the value you bring to the table justifies your price, what you don't want to be doing is apologizing for your price being what it is. Rather, what you want to be talking about is the value you bring to the table. So a better response when somebody says something like this is 5 or 10 times more expensive than competitor A, B, or C, nobody pays as much for this kind of thing. A better answer might be to say something like, you know what, I think the question you're asking me is, how is it, despite our product or our solution being 2 or 5 times more expensive than some of the people you just mentioned, how is it despite that we have a ton of people dying to buy our product? Like, what kind of value must we be bringing to the table that allows us to charge this price? And you know what? I'm happy to have that conversation with you. And you know why? It's because you and I both know at the end of the day, nobody's going to pay more for something than it's worth. You're not going to pay more for this than it's actually worth. So let's figure out what it's worth. And then you move the conversation towards the value proposition rather than getting hung up and stuck on a price haggle alone. Now, I'm not suggesting never apologize in your life. Far from it. If you do something wrong, you apologize. You own up to it. If you don't bring any value to the table and you're charging a ton of money, I suggest you apologize and lower your price. But if you think the value you bring to the table justifies the price that you are proposing, then instead of apologizing for it, getting defensive, backtracking, or legitimizing the reference points they just gave, instead what you want to do is shift the conversation to value rather than the cost or price. And in doing so, you might be able to achieve a deal that creates a lot of value for the other side, but also rewards your side for the value it created. Good luck. Video, I want to talk about a question that was raised by one of the viewers who sent in this question and wanted me to address the topic of negotiating when you have very little power. Now that's a very, very big topic. Spend an hour and a half on it. I could spend a whole day on it and chip away at that issue in a lot of different ways. So here, given that I'm only going to spend about 2 minutes on the entire video, I just want to provide one key insight that I think is crucial for anybody who's going to negotiate in an environment where they feel powerless, where they feel like they're the weaker party. And the thing I'd like you to remember when you're negotiating in such a situation is that typically when we think about who has power in a negotiation, we think about who's bigger and stronger. We think about who has deeper pockets. And certainly these things correlate with leverage. These things can give you the ability to influence other parties. But what effective negotiators understand is that your greatest source of leverage in a negotiation is often simply your ability to create value for the other side. What I'd like every one of my students and every one of my clients to always keep in mind is that if you have the ability to create value for the other parties, you have leverage. You may not be the bigger or stronger party. You may not be the party with deeper pockets. You may not be holding the bigger gun. But if you have the ability to create value for other folks, other parties in the negotiation, you have leverage. You might be uniquely situated to solve a problem that they have. If you can address one of their concerns, if you can address one of their needs, if you can help them resolve something that keeps them up at night, if you can solve their problems better than anybody else, even if you're not the only person who can solve them, or you can resolve them more effectively than other folks, you now have leverage. And then what you start to do as a negotiator is think about how do you frame the negotiation around the value you create for the other side. Because when you frame the negotiation from the point of view of the value you're bringing to the table, that's when you have the chance, the possibility of monetizing that value. And when you monetize the value that you create for others, well, that's when you get paid. So yes, it matters who's bigger or stronger in these traditional ways. But from a negotiation standpoint, the thing to always remember is if you create value for other parties, you have leverage. And then you move on to the steps regarding how do I make sure I'm able to use that leverage. Good luck. I want to talk about something that's suddenly become a lot more important for people, which is negotiating when you're not face-to-face. A lot of us, when this video is being recorded, are in lockdown during the coronavirus. A lot of businesses have either had to shut down or in other cases have to take their operations online. This includes team meetings, this includes communications with various stakeholders, and it means negotiations. And a number of folks have asked me about what changes when you start negotiating not face-to-face in the room together, but over a platform like Zoom or GoToMeeting or Skype, etc. And here I want to talk about some of the things that you might not even notice have changed during these platforms being used for negotiations, but which can have an impact on whether or not you have a successful negotiation. So let's talk about a few of the things that are different when you negotiate face-to-face versus over something like Zoom. First, face-to-face negotiations allow us to be much more comfortable with silence. When you're on a Zoom call or you're in a Zoom negotiation, people are not as comfortable just being quiet with nobody talking, especially if multiple people are online at the same time.
Silence during negotiations is actually pretty important and pretty useful. It gives you time to think. It gives you time to think about whether you want to change the trajectory of the conversation. If things are getting a little bit heated, it allows you to think about how to cool things down. So these informal, unscheduled moments of silence are actually pretty important. But when we get into a conversation over a platform like Zoom, they feel very uncomfortable, and people fill that space by talking. So that's one issue. The second thing is that face-to-face negotiations are often very nonlinear. We talk about one thing and then somebody decides to move the conversation in a slightly different direction. People don't think of it as being very awkward if a lot of things are flying around at the same time. Now think about the last Zoom conversation you had, or the last phone conversation you had where you were negotiating something. Much more likely that it was very path dependent. You each are responding and reacting to the last thing the person said. And because of that, the conversation is likely to be less divergent, less creative, and less likely to explore different avenues or different approaches for attacking the problem. The third thing that's different, especially if you're negotiating with multiple people on each side of the table, when you're face-to-face, typically all the people are in the room with you. That gives you a lot of opportunities in the room and during coffee breaks or when you get up to stretch or when you take a little break to caucus and coordinate with your team members. But when everybody is just a face on the screen and things are being thrown around from the two sides of the table, but you're not co-located with your own team, it's very hard to coordinate. And one of the consequences of that is that people become a little bit more risk averse. People become a little bit more conservative about what they will and will not say because they're not sure they're on solid ground as far as their own team is concerned. And the fourth thing that changes when you move from face-to-face negotiation to something like Zoom negotiation is even more subtle. If you've traveled a long way to go to the person's office that you're negotiating with or into their city if you've flown in, the two sides are going to be a little bit more persistent. When they run into roadblocks, when they run into deadlock, when they run into some sort of conflict or dispute, or if the offers seem very far apart, you're already there, you've already made the effort to be in the room, you try hard to push through it. It's a lot easier on a platform like Zoom to just call it off. If the two sides are too far apart, it's just very easy to say, you know what, doesn't look like we're going to get very far today. Let's call it quits. I mean, what's the cost? You haven't invested much, so it's a lot easier to just shut it down. Now let's think about those four problems. Zoom conversations, as opposed to face-to-face conversations, are less comfortable with silence. They're less linear, they're too linear. Your team is not co-located with you, so you can't coordinate as effectively. And it might be a little bit too easy for people to give up rather than push through when challenges arise. So what do you do about this? Well, first, just knowing those things, knowing those barriers exist, might change the way in which you approach the negotiation. But here are some specific things that I'd advise you to do, actually in many negotiations, but especially when you're negotiating through platforms like Zoom. First, it's very helpful to send an agenda to the other side up front with as many items that you think you want to cover already delineated. This makes it a little bit more likely that you don't get stuck on one conversation for too long, that you are able to leverage that agenda, that piece of paper that was sent in advance, to move the conversation along and make sure enough things are covered that are important to you. Second, not just sending an agenda, but perhaps sending the proposal that you want to discuss also in advance. Now, why would you do this? In negotiations, surprises are usually not helpful. If you're going to propose something creative, or if you're going to propose something that the other side would need to discuss, or maybe talk to their boss about, or really wrap their head around, the last thing you want to do is throw it at them in a Zoom call, and the only thing that they're able to do then is respond in a way that's very, very restrictive, that's not very, very creative, that's not open to new ideas or new suggestions. So sending a proposal in advance is a very good way of allowing the other side to show up more prepared. And perhaps counterintuitively to some people, the more prepared the other side is, actually negotiations are going to go more smoother for both of you. Now, I'll leave it up to you to think about how much of the proposal you want to share in advance and how soon to send it, because there is some variation on that. Sometimes I advise people to wait until maybe an hour before the conversation, before the proposal is sent, because you don't want it hanging out there for a very long time. Other times you want to give them even more time. Sometimes the proposal is going to be detailed. Sometimes it's going to be the outline of the proposal, but there's some things we want to fill in when we actually have the conversation. But sending something in advance can be pretty useful.
Next, because these meetings can abruptly end or can end maybe before everything was covered that you wanted to cover, it's useful if in advance you have already managed expectations and coordinated with the other side on the need for more than one of these calls. Don't try to do everything in one meeting in the way you might have been able to accomplish if it was face-to-face. Setting up a second or third meeting in advance gives you a little bit of space to leave things that didn't get covered without having some awkward conversation at the end of trying to schedule another meeting which maybe wasn't anticipated. So thinking of this as a longer process and a more carefully thought through process rather than I show up, we try to negotiate, and then we see what happens. Next, during the Zoom conversations themselves, schedule breaks. Again, you can coordinate on this before the negotiations begin, but decide in advance that if you're going to have a 1 hour conversation, that maybe 20 minutes into it or 30 minutes into it or every 15 to 20 minutes into it or every half an hour into your negotiations, you're going to take a bit of a break. It gives all sides a chance to step back, sort of clear their head, think a little bit about where they are and where they need to be going, and to coordinate with their own team. So instead of having to call an audible in the middle of the negotiation and say, you know what, I need to take a break, if you've already scheduled some of these in, it gives you that breathing space you need, the thinking space you need, and the coordination space you need. And finally, manage expectations. I think everybody walking into this new environment is a little bit anxious about how it's going to work. But it's useful if one of you, and why not you, be the one who says early on, listen, this is maybe not the way we typically do things, so perhaps some things might come across as awkward. We might end up talking over each other. There might be situations where one of us misunderstands each other. That's probably normal in this kind of a setting. So why don't we go ahead and make sure we give each other the benefit of the doubt? So if we say something that comes across as maybe too abrupt, or that it sounded like we weren't listening to you, or we missed something you said, you let us know and we'll do the same for you. And if we schedule a bit of a longer process for this, hopefully it's more likely to go well. With every negotiation, whether it's face-to-face or in a Zoom meeting, one of the things I advise people to do is after the negotiation is over, it's a good idea to send an email, a note to the other side or the other parties that were involved, just to touch base, make sure you were on the same page. You want to make sure things were heard appropriately and similarly by all parties. Sending an email or a note like that is a great way to confirm what was agreed to and where things stand in the process to date. It's also a good opportunity to ask questions that maybe you forgot to ask during the conversation because too much was going on. And finally, it provides an opportunity for you to frame the negotiations in the way you most want to frame them, to make sure they understand the extent to which you think this is an important negotiation, or whether you want to emphasize that you have other opportunities so you don't seem too weak, or whether you want to frame it a little bit in a more friendly way than it came across during the actual conversation. It gives you just one more bite at the apple. So send that email afterwards, send that note afterwards, and let people know. If you have any questions, let people know where you think you are in the process to make sure you're on the same page, and use it as an opportunity to reframe the negotiation in the best possible way. So to just reflect back on the things we talked about, Zoom negotiations or Skype or GoToMeeting negotiations differ from face-to-face negotiations because face-to-face negotiations, people are much more comfortable with silence. The conversations are much more nonlinear and less path dependent, which is a good thing. The teams are usually co-located and they can coordinate more effectively, and people feel committed to the process because they put the effort to being in there. All of these things can facilitate deal making. When you find yourself in a Zoom environment, those facilitators aren't there. So you need to be prepared in advance and to create a process in advance and approach the negotiation in advance in such a way that you knock down those barriers that these platforms, which otherwise are great, they're efficient, they're cost effective, they're actually pretty amazing in terms of getting a lot of work done in a lot of different ways. But we want to make sure that when we get down to the business of negotiating, we don't lose out simply because we don't know how to handle this technology in the best way possible. Good luck on your future. In this particular session, I want to talk about something that happens at the end of a negotiation. One thing I often advise my students and my clients is to never let a negotiation end with a no. Rather, a negotiation should end either with a yes, a deal was achieved, or it should end with an explanation for why not. In other words, I don't have a problem with a negotiation ending in impasse or a negotiation ending in no deal. Because often you're not the right partners for each other. If we are not going to create maximum value together and you would be better off with someone else, no deal is the right answer. If the best you can offer me is inferior to what I can get elsewhere, no deal is the right answer. The problem is not ending up with a no deal. The problem is when the negotiation ends and you're not even sure why you weren't able to reach an agreement. So what I always ask people after a negotiation failed or a negotiation didn't end in a deal, I should say, more appropriately, so what went wrong? How come you didn't reach an agreement? And if the answer is, I have no idea still, I still don't know what they really wanted, that's the mistake you want to avoid. So a negotiation should not end with a no. It should either end with a yes, because the deal was achieved, and then we can evaluate it on its merits, or it should end with an explanation from the other side and an understanding on both sides as to why this didn't work out. And when you get into the habit of finishing your negotiations, even those that don't end in a deal, with a conversation, with a mutual understanding of what could have been done differently, or under what conditions a deal would have been possible, and what specifically are the reasons we cannot see eye to eye today, or we cannot reach a deal today, you make it more likely that as you move forward, you can reevaluate when it might be time to go back to that party. Or you can reevaluate the next time you're negotiating with someone else, what you might want to do differently to make it more likely that you end up with the deal. So don't let your negotiations end with a no. Have them end with a yes, which is great. Or if it's going to end with a no, make sure you have a clear understanding, or as clear an understanding as possible, of what went wrong or what could have been done differently, or under what conditions maybe you would have been the right partners or created value. Good luck. In this session, I want to talk about an insight that actually comes to us from the world of mediation. If you've ever been in mediation because you were involved in a conflict or a dispute, especially if things got really ugly, what might have happened on the first day of mediation is that the mediator might have said something like the following. You two think you hate each other today? Well, we're going to be at this for about a week. And about 3 days into this process, you're going to hate each other more than you've ever hated each other. And when that day comes, I just want you to remember one thing. That's normal. That's normal. Now, why would a mediator say that? Well, let's think about what happens if the mediator doesn't say that. What happens on day 2 or 3 or 4 when the emotions are getting even higher than they've ever been? People are saying and feeling things they've never said or felt before. What are they going to think? And what are they going to do? All of a sudden, these folks that came into a mediation process will suddenly say to themselves, this isn't working. Things are getting worse, not better. We thought things are supposed to improve when we get here, not go worse as every day goes along. And what they're likely to do at that point is quit the process. Now, what happens when the mediator has said to these folks, listen, conflicts like this don't go from being bad to being good, getting better every day as you walk down that process. Things go from being bad to being good, not like this. They go from being bad to being good like this. And once the mediator has said that, all of a sudden, it's less likely that when that low point happens, the people involved in the conflict in the mediation session are actually going to quit the process because they're prepared for it, because you've managed those expectations. This is what's called normalizing the process. When you normalize the process, you let people know in advance what they're going to be going through, what they're going to be experiencing on this journey with you. And in my experience, normalizing the process isn't just important in ugly conflicts and difficult disputes where there's a lot of emotion and where there's a mediator involved. Normalizing the process is important in negotiations of all kinds. If you don't normalize the process for your partners in the negotiation, if you're negotiating a partnership, if you're negotiating a relationship, if you are negotiating a long-term deal, when things go wrong, that might have been predictable. When there's delays, disruptions, or other kinds of issues that arise, those things are going to get overweighted if you haven't managed those expectations and let people know what to expect. Now, the reason this doesn't happen enough, I believe, in negotiations is because too often when we're negotiating a deal on day one and when we're trying to ink the deal, we're optimizing just for that one goal, which is how do we maximize the likelihood that this person says yes? How do we maximize the likelihood that this person says yes to the deal or to the partnership or to the relationship that we envision? And in order to optimize for that, we end up too much focused on selling and talking about how great things are going to be and how things will never go wrong and how wonderful it is, that we don't prepare people for what actually might be inevitable downturns, inevitable difficulties, inevitable disruptions. And so, on the one hand, we've made it most likely that the person actually says yes to us. At the same time, we've sown the seeds of potential future discontent because we haven't prepared them or managed enough expectations about what the journey might look like. And so what effective negotiators do is they try to balance these two things. Instead of optimizing simply for how do we get them to say yes, how do we get them to sign the dotted line, we think about the negotiation journey that's going to go through the entire negotiation process, also afterwards in the relationship that's going to come out of it. And we prepare people for what that journey is going to look like, the good and the potentially bad. And when you do that, people don't end up overweighting delays, disruptions, and other kinds of hassles that show up because they were already warned about it. Their expectations were effectively managed. So as you negotiate your deals and as you negotiate and navigate disputes, it's important to always think about normalizing the process and to ask the other side to normalize the process for you so that you know better what to expect. So you know better when things are not going to go smoothly so that you can be prepared for those and you don't necessarily assume that it's because the other side is ill-intentioned or incompetent or is not out looking out for your best interest. Good luck. What I want to talk about is the problem of negotiating after a series of failures. When you go in to negotiate a deal where others before you have failed. Now, I do work with a lot of businesses, but I also do work with governments that are negotiating really difficult, for example, armed conflicts or other disputes. And in these kinds of negotiations, it's very common to walk into a situation that has been going on for a very long time. There's a lot of mistrust, there's a lot of hostility, there's a lot of antagonism, and there is a long history of failure of negotiation. So how do you approach a situation like that? Well, in my experience, too often what people do when they walk into a negotiation where previous attempts have failed is they walk in thinking that they're going to take a different approach. They're going to go to the negotiation table and say things differently and do things differently and make different kinds of moves and use different tactics at the negotiation table and hopefully achieve a better outcome. That's not usually the margin on which success and failure is decided, especially in very protracted negotiations or very, very protracted disputes. Rather, what I always advise people to do is to step back and first ask yourself the question, why would success be possible today when other people before me who might have been reasonably smart, reasonably competent, reasonably well-intentioned have failed? What's really different about the situation today? Or what can be made to be different about the situation today? The key thing that I want people to recognize is that what you do once you get to the table is not usually what's going to determine success or failure in these difficult situations. Rather, it's more likely that one of four things will have to change for a previously unsuccessful negotiation to transition towards a successful negotiation. So what are those four things you need to be thinking about? First, have the conditions changed, or can they be made to be changed? Perhaps previously the other side had a lot of alternatives. Has that changed? Perhaps previously the other side had a lot of spoilers that they were dealing with who didn't want a deal to happen. Has that changed? Are you bringing something new to the table that you didn't have the ability to bring to the table before? What about the conditions have changed? What's new today that wasn't true before? So that's the conditions. The second is, has the scope changed, or can it be changed? By the scope of the negotiation, we mean what are the things that are going to be within the bounds of negotiation. It's possible that the last time the negotiation took place, there were too few issues or too few interests that were being considered. And instead, what you're going to do this time is broaden the scope so that there's more possibility of give and take. Or it might be the opposite. Maybe too many things were on the table last time, and the reason you think you're going to succeed this time is because you've narrowed the scope to things that are more manageable and more tractable. So the conditions could change or the scope could change. The third thing that could have changed or that you might be able to change is the process. Are we sequencing things in the same way we've always sequenced them? Are we giving ourselves just as much time as we did last time, or are we giving ourselves more time? Are we bringing in different parties into the room? Because perhaps the problem last time was that the wrong people were in the room. Has the process been adjusted to overcome the failures of the past. So you have conditions, you have scope, you have process, and the final thing to consider is the frame of the negotiation. The frame of the negotiation essentially refers to the psychological lens through which people are looking at the deal or dispute. Are they seeing us as desperate the way they did last time, or do they see us as having a little bit more strength or credibility or leverage? Do they think that we are antagonistic the way they did think last time, or have we changed those perceptions? If the frame of the negotiation changes, just like if the process changes, the scope changes, or the conditions change, all of a sudden, what was a no deal situation can suddenly become a yes deal situation. Of course, it matters what you do once you get to the table. Of course, it matters what you say and how you say it and the tactics that you use. But too often, people overweight that element of negotiation and fail to consider these other levers: the conditions that we're walking into, the scope of the negotiation, the process, and the frame. When you think about all of these dimensions of negotiation, it's much more likely that you will succeed where others have failed. Good luck. Topic of negotiation, and in each clip I give one idea, one insight, one principle, one tactic that I hope will help you as you negotiate your own deals and disputes at work and in your everyday life. In this video, what I want to talk about is the importance of managing the attributions the other side makes of your behavior in negotiation. Let me start with a short story. Some years ago, I was doing some negotiation training in the Middle East, and we were doing an exercise. We were doing a simulation, and there was a group of people in the room, and they were supposed to simulate a buyer-seller negotiation. So as these participants were doing their negotiation, while they were doing the simulation, I was walking around and sort of checking in on the different groups and listening in on what they were doing. And in one particular negotiation, early on, we had the seller make an opening offer that was actually quite extreme. I knew what the case was. I knew what each side was willing and unwilling to do. So I could tell the moment the seller made the offer, it was just completely out of the zone of what could have been possible. It was a very aggressive opening offer. In reaction, I noticed that the buyer just sat there still and staring at the seller, saying nothing, completely silent, quiet for an awkward amount of time, maybe 10 seconds. After a little while, the conversation started again, and I moved on. When the group reconvened and we were going to discuss the negotiation and talk about the different deals that groups got, we noticed that there was only one group that didn't reach a deal, and it was the group that I had walked by during that moment. And when I realized that, I sort of brought these two to the front of the room, and I said, so, I was walking by your negotiation, and I noticed what happened. You were negotiating, and you, the seller, I remember made a pretty aggressive offer. And I remember you, the buyer, just sitting there quietly. Tell me what happened there. And the buyer says, well, the seller started the negotiation, and they came in with a really aggressive offer. And so I decided to give them the silent treatment. And I said, oh, the silent treatment. And what exactly is the silent treatment? And he said, oh, the strategy where you just sit there quietly and you make them feel uncomfortable, and then they start negotiating against themselves. And I said, oh, okay, that. How did that go? And so the buyer says, well, I just sat there quietly, making sure they knew that this was completely ridiculous. Then I turned to the seller and I said, so when you made that offer and the buyer sat there quietly, did you start to feel uncomfortable and anxious? Did you start to lower your price? And the seller says, oh my God, I completely missed that. And I said, what do you mean? And the seller says, when I made that offer, I knew it was a really aggressive offer. I was pretty sure that this was an extreme ask. But then, when he just sat there quietly, looking like he was thinking about it, I thought to myself, oh my God, I wasn't aggressive enough. And so when we finally got back into the give and take, I was not going to lower my price one bit because I thought I'd already given too good of an offer if he was sitting there considering it. Now, think about what happened there. The buyer is sending a signal, they think, about what their silence means. And the seller is interpreting it in a completely different way. This is not just about silence. This is about everything we do in a negotiation. What effective negotiators do is that they make sure that they are managing the attributions the other side is going to make about their behavior. If you don't call back too soon,
Does that show you're confident and comfortable and a strong negotiator? Or does it show you're uninterested? Which message were you trying to give? If you speak a lot in a negotiation, do you come across as you're in control? Or do you end up sending the signal in the culture that you're in or in the environment that you're in that you're very insecure or rude? As you think about the behaviors you engage with as a negotiator, the thing you always want to keep in mind is that anything you say and anything you do is supposed to be sending a signal that is consistent with the message you want to send to them and the frame you want to create in the negotiation. But too often, we're so much in our own head, we're not thinking about how this behavior will actually be interpreted by somebody who's seeing the negotiation from a different point of view, who comes from a different background, who comes from a different set of experiences. What will this look like to them? And so what effective negotiators do to manage the attributions that they make is twofold. One, you need to understand how somebody like this would interpret this kind of behavior based on your understanding of their background and their approach to negotiations and what they're dealing with and what they're trying to accomplish. But also, you want to make sure that you give enough clarity to what your behaviors represent, that you don't leave it up to chance. So if you're just going to be silent and then start talking, that's maybe too ambiguous. Maybe when you start talking, you want to reinforce the point you were trying to convey with your silence. When you don't call somebody back, or when you talk too much in a negotiation, you want to make sure you're giving enough additional context, enough additional justification, enough additional information so they know how to interpret what it is that you're saying and you're doing. And to the extent possible, you want to be consistent across your various messages. When you manage the attributions the other side makes to your behavior, to your words, you make it less likely that there is miscommunication or that you undermine your own strategy. In this video, I want to talk about lie detection. Now, this is a very big topic, and there's a lot of time that could be spent on it. So here I'm just going to talk about one key insight that, if you remember, is going to help you defend against lies and deception in negotiations of various kinds. And I want to start with the key insight that I want you to remember. Most people don't like to lie. Most people don't like to lie, but they don't mind if you are deceived. Now let's see what happens if you keep this insight in mind as you engage with people in negotiations, deals, disputes, etc. The idea here is that most people don't like to tell lies. Now, why? Well, it could be that they don't want to get caught in a lie strategically. It could be that they feel bad lying or they think that it's unethical. Most people don't like to say things that they know are untrue if they can avoid it. However, and this is the second part of the insight, they don't mind if you are deceived by them. In other words, people are much more comfortable if they are able to not lie, but still get away with giving you the wrong impression. So too often what people will do, especially when you ask them a focused question, a direct question about something, in order to avoid lying, but still getting what they want out of the situation, what people will often end up doing as a result is, instead of answering the question you asked, they will often, somewhat subtly, answer a slightly different question than the one you asked, a related question to the one you asked. So you might say something like, is this the lowest price you can give me? And the reaction might be, are you kidding? We've never given a lower price to anybody in our whole life. Now think about what just happened here. You asked, can you lower the price? And the response was, we've never given a lower price to anybody before. Now, what the person didn't do is answer your question. So one really useful trick or technique for detecting lies is the following. Ask focused questions and then listen very carefully to the answer that is given or not given. Too often, what people will end up doing is, instead of answering the question, they'll give you a response that makes you feel like the question was answered, that makes you feel like the answer is what they want you to believe, but they have chosen not to actually engage in the question as asked. Now you have to ask yourself, in situations like that, why do they do it? If the answer to the question, can you lower the price, was truly no, the easiest thing for them to have done is to have said, no, we cannot lower the price under any conditions. For some reason, the person chose not to answer that question.
They could have said it unambiguously. They could have said it very directly. They could have said it in one word. And instead, they answered a slightly different question and gave you a longer answer that, if anything, could leave some doubt. That's the red flag. When you get into the habit of asking direct and focused questions and listening carefully to the answer that was given or the answer that was not given, often you can find out what the reality of the situation actually is. So when I ask a question of the kind that I just gave, can you lower the price? Is there any way you can lower the price? And the person chooses to answer the question in a slightly different way. That's the red flag. That's where I start to think, okay, a lower price is probably possible in this situation. Now I just need to figure out what kinds of arguments do I need to make, at what time in the negotiation or what part of the process should I be pushing for a lower price, to whom should I be having this conversation or with whom, through what channels should this conversation take place, etc. Because I've already figured out that with some high degree of probability that a lower price probably is possible, because otherwise the answer would have been no. Now, in a broader conversation here, I'd be talking a lot about when it is not appropriate to ask direct and focused questions, other ways of detecting lies, etc. But for now, if you just keep this actionable insight in mind, just the fact that most people don't like to lie, but they don't mind if you're deceived, and you couple it with the advice, which is to get into the habit of not just asking focused questions, but remembering to listen carefully to the answer that was given or what was not said, you'll be much better equipped to figure out when somebody's trying to get away with something that may not be completely honest. Good luck. In this video, what I want to talk about is barriers to negotiation. And specifically, I want to talk about 3 types of barriers to negotiation that can derail deals that otherwise should happen. Now let's start with clarifying what do we mean by deals that should happen. Because in my experience, most negotiations in the world shouldn't end in a deal. If we are not the right partners for each other, if you would be better off with someone else, or I would be able to get a better deal with someone else, the two of us should not reach a deal. It doesn't create value. We're not the right partners for each other. And that is the modal case in negotiations. Not everybody is a partner with whom you're going to create maximum value, almost by definition. So not reaching a deal is not a tragedy. The problem is when a deal should have happened, when we were the right partners for each other, when we were the people who could have created the most value together, but something got in the way of us achieving that value creating outcome. Something got in the way of us reaching an understanding or an agreement. How to avoid that? In my experience, one of the things that you need to do as a negotiator before you launch into negotiations, before you take the first step in the process, as you're preparing for the negotiation, one of the things you need to do to be an effective negotiator is to spend some time thinking about the barriers to negotiation. What are the kinds of things that might kill a deal that otherwise should happen? And I find it useful to put these barriers or categorize these barriers into 3 types. It helps organize your thinking and it helps organize your strategizing. So what are the 3 types of barriers? First, psychological barriers. These are the things that are happening in my mind or in the minds of other people in the negotiation. Perhaps there's not enough trust. Perhaps we don't like each other very much. Perhaps there's a lot of pessimism because previous attempts at negotiation have failed. Perhaps there is a sense of grievance. These are psychological elements that might get in the way of a deal. The second type of barrier is what we call a structural barrier to negotiation. Think of a structural barrier as a barrier that presents itself just because of the rules of the game that we're playing, just because of the design of the environment in which we are negotiating. For example, a structural barrier might be that there's very little time. We have just too little time to try and reach a deal that's actually quite complex. A structural barrier might be that the wrong people are at the table, or the people that I need to be talking to are not accessible to me. In conflicts of various kinds, a structural barrier might be that there's too much media attention, and it's making it hard for people to make concessions without looking bad. So these are design elements that are getting in the way of a deal that we think should happen. The third type of barrier is what we call tactical barriers. Tactical barriers are actions that we actually take in the negotiation. Something that I actually am doing in the negotiation or something the other side is doing in the negotiation that is causing there to be a barrier to us reaching an agreement.
Now, usually these behaviors are not completely crazy. They're usually justifiable. Usually the things that I'm doing in a negotiation or the other side is doing in the negotiation, there's some rationale for it. It's just that it's also having the consequence of making a deal more difficult. For example, I'm not sharing very much information. Perhaps wisely because I don't trust you very much, but it might also make a deal difficult to achieve. Or you are being very aggressive and you're asking for a really aspirational amount in the negotiation. Now, that may make sense because the more you ask for, perhaps if a deal does happen, the more you end up with at the end of the day. But along the way, you are also making the deal a little bit more difficult because we might never be able to bridge that difference. Another tactical barrier might simply be that we're focusing too narrowly on one or two issues when by broadening the scope of the negotiation, we could have actually reached an agreement. So, as you think about this from the point of view of day one in your negotiation, as you think about the day that you're going to start the process and you're building your strategy, in my experience, when you take the time to think through what are the psychological, what are the structural, and what are the tactical barriers that might get in the way of the deal, it allows you to now think about how you need to adjust your strategy so that you can start knocking down some of these barriers. What are the things we may need to do given that there is pessimism or given that there is mistrust? How do we deal with the fact that the wrong people might be at the table? How do we deal with the fact that there may not be enough time to do everything we want to do? How do we deal with the fact that both parties are coming in rather aggressively, or that we might be focusing too narrowly on the scope of the negotiation because we're just trying to make some progress, but it might make a broader, complete deal less likely? Once you recognize the barriers you face, it's not surprisingly more likely that you'll have a strategy that you conceive of, that you build, and that you launch, which will be more effective at overcoming those barriers. So the deals that should happen actually come to fruition. Good luck. In this video, I want to talk about 5 mistakes that people often make when they're preparing for negotiations. These are the things that can get you off on the wrong foot from the very beginning. Having advised many companies on deals and disputes of all kinds, here are the things that I've often seen that make me step back and say, wait a second, this might not be the right start to a negotiation. First mistake, having too few people or too few perspectives in your preparation meeting. One of the reasons when I advise a company or when I am advising a team on a negotiation, I usually fly to their city rather than inviting them to where I am in Boston, is because if I have them come visit me, too often very few of them show up. Maybe just the CEO shows up. Maybe just the person in charge of the deal and one other person on their team shows up. I like to have access to a lot more perspectives on a negotiation, especially an important negotiation, if we're going to prepare for it effectively. So often I will travel to their hometown, to their headquarters, so that we have access to many more people. And instead of having only 2 people in the room talking about the negotiation, what we want, what the other side might want, what might go right, and what might go wrong, we have 4, 5, 6, 7 different perspectives. So the first mistake people often make is too few people or too few perspectives in the room when you're preparing. Second mistake, the arguments we're going to make in order to have them
concede to our demands, and not enough focus on what are the things that they want and what are the arguments that they're going to make. What should we expect them to be saying? How might they frame the negotiation? What might they say that surprises us or makes us defensive? There's so much of a focus on what we rightly deserve and what might be good arguments on our side that we fail to take enough of a perspective and spend enough time thinking about what are they talking about right now as they prepare? How are they going to frame this negotiation? What will their strategy look like? How are they going to try to achieve their objectives? Third mistake, not thinking enough about constraints on their side. What are the things they can and cannot do? What are the mistakes we might make because we assume they have flexibility in certain areas? And what are the opportunities we might lose out on because we don't realize they have more flexibility in other areas? How might doing the deal on the terms we're asking for create precedents that they can't live with? Are there other parties that are relevant to the negotiation that might not be in the room, but that might be impacting their ability to make the deal or agree to certain deal terms? So thinking enough about the other side's constraints is often something that's missing in preparation. Next, fourth mistake, focusing too much on substance and not enough on process. Getting deep down, narrowly focused on the give and take that's going to take place. What is our offer going to be? How are we going to make the offer? How are we going to respond to their offer? Thinking so much about what's going to happen at the table and not paying enough attention to the fact that that table, that meeting, that negotiation is actually part of a longer process. Asking questions like, how much time should we devote to this? How should we sequence different aspects of this negotiation? What are some milestones we should be looking at? Should we have a framework agreement before we get into the substance and the details on any one element of this? Who are all the parties that we should invite into the process and at what time? Stepping back and thinking about whether the process that's laid out, either by default or by the other side, whether or not that's actually advantageous to us is an important part of your preparation. And fifth, zooming out. As I mentioned earlier, too often people are focused on the substance of the deal, but not focused enough on the process that's going to get us from where we are today to eventually a final outcome that we are happy with. The related mistake about being too narrowly focused is people aren't thinking enough about how this negotiation relates to their broader objectives as an organization. How does this negotiation play a role in the broader strategy that the organization is pursuing? In my experience, you can negotiate every deal that comes to the table brilliantly. Do the best give and take, do the best resolution of disputes, do the best framing of a negotiation, capture and create a lot of value in every negotiation that comes to the table. But you still end up losing as an organization because you haven't stepped back and thought about which negotiations should be doing and should we not be doing. How will this negotiation impact our ability to make deals in the future? Are there things we should and should not agree to here that might cause pain in the future as we try to pursue our broader strategy as an organization? So what are those 5 mistakes again? First, too few people and too few perspectives at the table when you're preparing. Second, focusing so much on our own interests and the arguments we're going to make, not thinking enough about how they're going to enter the negotiation and the arguments they're going to make. Third, not thinking enough about their constraints. How are their hands tied? Where is there more and less flexibility? Fourth, thinking too much about the substance of the deal and not enough about the process that gets us from here to there. And finally, being so focused on this deal and this negotiation and getting as much value as we can from this negotiation and not thinking carefully enough about how this negotiation fits into the portfolio of decisions, the portfolio of negotiations that we want to be conducting over time. A lot of companies on a lot of different kinds of deals, but the hardest negotiations I get involved with relate to protracted, intractable conflicts between governments and armed groups, governments and insurgencies. And to be perfectly honest, most of those negotiations aren't going to end with the deal being signed and implemented. Most of those specific negotiations, individual discussions, are going to end in no deal. Even in business disputes, even in interpersonal disputes, the end of the conversation is usually not going to herald an entirely new way of living and working together. Too often when we walk out of these negotiations, the problem is still unsolved. The two sides still don't really like each other, or don't trust each other, or don't really want to work together. How should we fail smarter in those cases? How should we end those negotiations so that perhaps the next time we or someone else tries to improve the relationship or increase the odds of a deal, it's more likely to be successful? I have 3 criteria that I think about when thinking about how to finish a negotiation that isn't ending in a deal, especially one that's been very contentious or hostile. First, your objective in the negotiation, in addition to trying to get the deal or resolving the problem, should always be respect. What I mean by that is, when the negotiation is over, what I'd like the other side to be able to say about how I handled the negotiation and how I approached the negotiation and what I did and said in the negotiation is the following. I want them walking away able to say, you know what? I still don't like this person. I still don't think this deal is going to happen. But I'll tell you one thing. I respect the way they handled themselves. I can respect them for how they approached this difficult situation. That doesn't mean we're going to agree, but I can respect that. That's one objective. So in addition to trying to get the deal done, you want to make sure that you negotiate in a way that allows the other person to at least walk away thinking, you know what? I don't like where we ended up. I don't like where we are. I don't like this person, but I can respect them for how they handled their difficult situation. The second thing to try to do is learn as much as you can during that negotiation. If the negotiation ends in no deal, if it ends with the dispute being still unresolved, did you spend time during that conversation, during that discussion or series of discussions, learning as much as you can about the other side, about what barriers might be standing in the way of a deal? What are the things that would need to change so that a deal might be possible in the future? Or were you too busy making your arguments, making your case, trying to convince them of something that ultimately they were unconvinced about? So ending in a no deal is no problem as long as you really prioritize learning during that process. And third, the third aspect of feeling smart is making sure you've sown some seeds that other people or you in the future can use to start from a better position the next time. Perhaps you haven't solved the entire dispute, but you've reached some understanding, or you've overcome some argument on some aspect of the dispute. Or perhaps you haven't been able to resolve the dispute, but you've agreed to sitting down again sometime in the future. Or perhaps you've agreed to some common framing of some element of the problem. So when you fail smart, you want to be thinking about these 3 things. At the end of the day, can the other side walk away, perhaps not liking me or trusting me, but at least respecting me for the way I handled this negotiation? That I was open and honest, that I was clear about my intentions, that I wasn't playing games, that I kept my cool? Can they respect my approach? Second, have I walked away learning as much as I possibly could during that negotiation so that I'll be better prepared and better equipped to try and address this issue in the future? And third, have I done what I can in this negotiation with the other side to sow the seeds of future success? Made it so that the next time somebody runs with this, or if I come back to this problem, we'll be a little bit farther ahead than we are today. You won't succeed in every negotiation if by success we mean problems are going to be fully resolved, the two sides are going to have a complete meeting of the minds, you're going to have a signed deal, and it's going to get implemented. In difficult negotiations, in complex negotiations, in protracted conflicts, that is not usually what you're going to achieve the first time you sit down. But that doesn't mean if you fail, you can't fail smart. Good luck. Now, what's an ultimatum? It's any absolute statement where there's no wiggle room. Take it or leave it, final offer, we will never do X, you must do X, etc. Now, there's lots of reasons you may not want to make ultimatums. The most obvious one being, well, it can create some bad blood. The other side might feel like they have to reciprocate. They might get upset. They might feel like they need to draw their own red lines, etc. So let's think about when you should and when you shouldn't use ultimatums in a negotiation. There's 2 basic criteria to consider from my point of view, and then I'll discuss a few more issues related to the use of ultimatums. The first is, never make an ultimatum unless you're willing to follow through on it. In negotiations, your credibility is everything. So if you're going to make an ultimatum, if you're going to draw a red line, you need to make sure you follow through on the consequences if the other side does not behave in the way you're asking them to behave. So only make ultimatums if you're actually planning on following through with them. And second, even if it is a real ultimatum, as in you would follow through if the other side did not acquiesce, even then you want to pass a second test, which is there a less aggressive way to achieve my outcome, to achieve my objectives, than to make an ultimatum? As mentioned earlier, ultimatums can... Second, even if it is a real ultimatum, as in you would follow through if the other side did not acquiesce, even then you want to pass a second test, which is there a less aggressive way to achieve my outcome, to achieve my objectives, than to make an ultimatum? As mentioned earlier, ultimatums can create negative reciprocity. It can escalate conflicts. It can make disputes worse. It can create negative reciprocity. It can escalate conflicts. It can make disputes worse. So if I can achieve the same objective with a less aggressive tactic, with a less aggressive technique, by negotiating differently, by being more persuasive in a different way, by coming back to the situation at a different time or through a different channel, etc., I'm going to try to achieve the same objective that I was going to achieve with my ultimatum with something that's less aggressive and less threatening. So those are the two criteria. One, is it a real ultimatum? Would I actually follow through? And two, is there any other way I can achieve these objectives without resorting to an ultimatum? Now, a couple things. First, let's not assume that ultimatums are always bad. If there is something that you cannot live with, if there are deal terms, if there are demands the other side would be making that would not be acceptable to you, it's actually in your interest and their interest if you let them know that. It doesn't help either side if you keep that to yourself and the other side ends up putting something in the deal that you then have to walk away with. So an ultimatum isn't always a bad thing. So making ultimatums, as a result, is not always unwise. The second thing to consider, of course, is that more gray zone. These are the ultimatums you might end up making sometimes, which are a bit of a gamble. You probably could have lived with the demands they're making, but you just don't want them to make those demands. You probably could live with the terms or the provisions that they're planning on putting in or demanding of you, but you would really prefer not to have that happen because it takes money out of your pocket. There are situations like that where you may still want to make an ultimatum, but if you're going to do that, you always want to go back to those same first two principles. First, it's a gamble, but once I've made the ultimatum, I'm going to want to make sure I follow through on it, which makes it a risk. And two, have I exhausted all other less aggressive means of achieving my outcomes? If you keep those two principles in mind, you're more or less going to be safe in situations where you're considering making an ultimatum. Good luck.